So moving on to the Z-scale, we're going to start at a very specific place, and that place is this bar right here. And the same way that the R-scale is labeled with individual characteristics and their phenomenon, the Z-scale is also labeled with individual characteristics and their phenomenon as well. So the Z-scale, in the standard sense, has these primary communication types, and I'll label them so we can talk about all of them at once. It should be fairly easy, but we have this one, this one, this one, and this one. Those are all labeled with the lowercase Roman numerals, and that describes the standard range of post-intelligence, which is a little bit difficult to define since it differs so much from the R-scale. But each one of these ranges has their own name, so we'll go ahead and have them here. So the first one, that's the lowercase Roman numeral 1, is referred to as metaphysical communication. And then the Roman numeral number 2 is going to be impulsive communication. And the Roman numeral number 3 is going to be compulsive. And then number 4, we have compulsive impulse. So this entire thing represents the quote-unquote normal range, but the optimal operating range is just going to be metaphysical communication. Each one of these are sort of defined by the amount of information that's being processed. And the other thing that I want to go ahead and add just to this up here are the components of impulse. So we have the component of impulse, we have the subtraction, and then we also have the compression. And these help define these ranges. It helps define why each one of these are different from one another and why they're separate from just being impulse on its own. So if you remember the Z-naught scale, all 3 of these are required for one cycle of communication. When we get to the Z-scale, these individual components are going to define our ranges. And we'll sort of go through that really quickly. But to begin with, we're going to actually just write down which range is which. So the range, in terms of characteristics of communication for metaphysical, are going to be negative 180 to negative 185. And actually defining this characteristic of negative 180 is something that requires a few things to consider. One of them is the fact that to get there, we have to go through the gap. We have to have the brain slow itself down, we have to have that physiological response and all that stuff going on, and we're essentially putting the brain into an energy saving mode. We're trying to facilitate survival, we're trying to get to a better place where there's not as much going on. There are all kinds of evolutionary aspects similar to that. And the whole purpose of doing that is to prevent the brain from overworking itself and from taxing itself. So on top of that, that sort of inverts some of the chemistry that's responsible for handling all of the limits and all the stuff that's going on in intelligence. So all of those changes sort of invert everything, it compresses everything, and it squeezes them down into these little tiny ranges, where here we have 117 different characteristics, that ratio of information. All of that now has to be handled by this little tiny range, which is from 180 to 185. And all of the information that we have is compressed, and it's sort of transmuted into that little range. And what we're doing is selectively accessing representations of what was going on in intelligence. And the term that the book version uses for this landing spot, kind of the baseline status after hitting the gap, is something called the turnaround. You could also refer to it as the metaphysical orientation, but there's not really necessarily a specific term for that because you land in that range. And very likely, unless you're just thinking to yourself and it happens, but if you're communicating with someone or there's some other thing going on, there's a chance that you're going to have to continually use this range in order to handle whatever situation you may be in. So the thing that defines that range, separate from the other sort of normal ranges, are the components of impulse. So in the best case scenario, in the normal sense, once you get to the metaphysical range, you can still solve those problems using all three components of impulse. You're going to have the impulse, you're going to have the subtraction, and then you're going to have the compression. And every time that you go through this process of impulse, subtraction, compression, you're going to use up one of these characteristics. But the other thing is that you may end up doing something where you have an impulse and then you're comparing information, but you need to compare even more information in the environment. So the first one can start here, but then you can go to another impulse and then try to compare information there. And then maybe there's something that you recognize between those things. So now you have another compression that's over here. And then you realize that if something else is true, then that information can fit between there. And then that allows you to make a sort of draw a conclusion about something else. And then all of a sudden now you have like the final cycle of communication that solves whatever problem it is that you needed. So you have the potential to use any of these to solve the problems that are going on, but if you look, you have negative 180, that's this one right here. So we have negative 180, this one is maybe negative 181, this one's maybe negative 182, this one negative 183, okay, that's fine. You're still in the normal range, you know, and if you add something to that, you'll be at negative 184. So worst case scenario, when you do something like that, you end up at 184, you're in the normal range. So now, 184, you've gone through the entire thing, you've compressed that information. Now, to solve whatever problem you needed, the only thing you have to use is a single cycle of communication, which would be negative 180 again. You know, after you've resolved that problem, you kind of, you know, reattend to it, and all of a sudden you just have one cycle of communication to solve that problem, and that becomes your metaphysical orientation. So if you notice, going through that whole mess is related to what you already know, it's related to whoever you're communicating with, it's related to comparing information and all that kind of stuff. So it's fairly efficient, but it's also very limited. And as long as you stay within that range, you can continually do that. You can do that much more easily than you could do something in horizontal thinking, for example, or much more easily than you could in supersocial communication. So it's sort of like the energy saving mode of the brain. It's really efficient, it's meant to be really efficient, and it's designed to handle all those different aspects using not only environmental information, but new information, and then trying to make some meaning out of that, trying to figure out why it's important. And once again, this entire range is defined by access to impulse, subtraction, and compression. And that's the best case scenario in the Z-scale. That's exactly what you want to be able to do, to be able to solve problems and to resolve them and continue to the next set of problems and resolve them and so forth. But the other thing that can happen, which is still considered normal, is that you get overwhelmed again. There's too much information, you keep going through these different processes, and once you try adding them all up, there's too much information there. There are too many cycles that are being used in order to solve whatever problem's going on. So what ends up happening is that you hit a limit. You kind of have another problem where the amount of information is a little bit too much to handle. And the best way to describe that is by thinking all the way back to the sort of really brief idea that there is a magnitude to each one of these. And if you remember, the magnitude of impulse is 1/2, the subtraction should be 3/2, and then the compression should be -1/2. So what ends up happening is that the number of impulses, let's say you multiply this by 5, and you get 5/2 here, are going to exceed the number of compressions. If you have 4 of these, then you're only going to have 2 there, which is the same as kind of like 4/2. You know. So now all of a sudden there are too many impulses and there's too much information for the compression to be able to reverse what's going on. And once you get kind of over that limit, that reversal of that process is no longer possible. So the sort of consequence of that is that you have access to impulse and you have access to subtraction, but now you're no longer able to recompress that information. So instead of having the normal impulse, subtraction, compression, and that pattern and so on, now you're left with impulse and subtraction only, but it's very difficult to store that information without some other intervention. And the range that normally happens there is from -186 to -191. And that's essentially the number of times you can go from impulse to subtraction and then just leave it at that. Impulse to subtraction, like, okay, I saw it, okay, I saw it, okay, I saw it, but it's very difficult to say I saw it, and this is exactly what it is and what it means, and actually being able to store and from there manipulate the information. So the only thing that you're getting at that point is just comparing whether or not that information is actually there. It's not really comparing it to what you know. It's not really comparing it and making meaning out of it. It's just realizing, okay, that thing is there. And that's basically as far as you can go with it. And if you think about it in a survival kind of sense, you're not taking the time to sit there and figure out if it's dangerous or not. You don't have the resources. Your brain has already told you don't have the resources, so you just have to get away from it. You have to continue on. You don't have the sort of capacity at that point to try to make any meaning of it. It's just recognizing things and kind of continuing on to move. And anyway, once that happens a certain number of times, which you kind of look through the number of times you can do it by comparing the amount of impulse and the amount of subtraction to the number of times that you go through it, you'll sort of push yourself out of that range. And at that point, you kind of lose the capacity for subtraction. So now the only thing you have is impulse. And now there's no more subtraction and there's no more compression. The only thing you have is impulse. The only thing you can do is try to find a different direction to move. You can just try to get to the next thing. As soon as you realize there may be something there, it's enough to get away from that thing. If you kind of think about it in a sort of survival sense, you kind of continue thinking about it in a sort of survival sense. And that range is from -192 all the way to -197. And that's really it. That's as far as you can really take the process of making meaning out of your environment, because all you're doing at that point is just focusing on whether or not something's there. And even if you think something's there, it's very difficult to try to tell what it is or try to recognize it or try to obtain any real information from it. And beyond that, you can lose all 3 capacities. You can lose the capacity for impulse, you can lose the capacity for subtraction, and you can also lose the capacity for compression. And at that point, you are beyond the normal range. It's -197 plus. And the only thing that keeps you going is any stimulation. And there are a couple of different ways to think about that, but you're essentially on your last leg of survival. You're kind of going into like complete primal mode again, and doing nothing but trying to survive being chased down or whatever. But if you can consider like complete and utter fear or complete and utter need for survival, that's kind of what it's like. But it doesn't necessarily have to be survival. It can also just be exhaustion. It could be the need to rest. It could be the need for water or food or something like that. But essentially, you've kind of taxed your brain to the limit. the thing that defines each one of these ranges is the components of impulse that you have access to during any given time. We have the metaphysical range, which is kind of normal. This limit, which I'm not sure I mentioned, it's referred to as a vertical gap. The same way that there's the intelligent gap. Once you kind of get past that point of consideration, once you get past the point of consideration on the Z-scale, you have the vertical gap, which is in between metaphysical and impulsive communication. And then you have impulsive communication, and that only has impulse and subtraction associated with it. Compulsive communication has impulse associated with it only, and the compulsive impulse is whatever stimulation happens. There's no real attempt to do any of this anymore. It's just external stimulation or some kind of adulterating internal stimulation. But there's no really any attempt to make meaning at that point. It's just whatever's causing that stimulation from there. So in a normal sense, this is how you would go about making meaning of the environment. But the other way to kind of think about it is in a relational sense. So impulsive communication just means that you're pointing things out to people. Like maybe you think of yourself in a social situation. In impulsive communication, you're just pointing things out to people, but you're not really thinking through why it's important. You're just, if something's blaringly obvious or something's kind of just sticking out in the environment, you just sort of mention that. And you say, hey, look at that, but there's nothing beyond that. There's no interpretation. It's not like, look at that, it's crashing, or, it's not like, look at that, we need to move away from it. It's just look at that, sort of that kind of thing. In compulsive communication, beyond just experiencing impulse, you can also respond to other people's impulse. So if you notice that somebody else is making meaning of something, you can respond to the fact that they're making meaning of it. But you're only doing so through the process of impulse. So there's lots of reliance on other people in compulsive communication. And then once again, in compulsive impulse, it's just whatever stimulation happens. And if you work the other way through it, in compulsive communication, you can sort of think of that as a sort of transmutation of orthogonal communication. What you're doing is recognizing orthogonal thinking, and you can kind of parallel impulsive communication to orthogonal thinking as well as supersocial communication, and then you can sort of parallel metaphysical communication to horizontal thinking. So horizontal, both of these have aspects of orthogonal thinking in them, and then both of these have aspects of absolute thinking in them. So sort of a transmutation, sort of the kind of pattern to recognize is sort of a transmutation of what the R scale is saying, and it's very much a congruency to that. And there are a few other kind of patterns that way, but that's another way to think of it, as being more or less reliant upon going through intelligence to get those types of patterns of things. So sort of horizontal thinking, orthogonal thinking, and absolute thinking. So if we consider this entire thing to be the Z-scale, there are a couple of areas, and this whole area right here, which I'll just label lowercase a, that's all the post-intelligent communication types, the metaphysical, impulsive, compulsive, and compulsive impulse, and they're defined by the components of impulse that you have access to within the ranges. But then there's also this area that's sort of in between the gap and where this turnaround starts, where the metaphysical orientation is. And there aren't really any bars there, but there's a range that exists right there, and we can go ahead and mention what that is about. And that's something that's referred to as rolling communication, and it's a little bit different dynamic than these different communication types. So if you notice from the gap, you sort of land right here at metaphysical communication, and you go from negative 180 to more negative to more negative to more negative to even more negative. So you're sort of moving in an energy saving direction by sort of reducing the overall load on the brain. And the other thing you can do, in theory, is get to this turnaround point and then go in a positive direction. And if you go that direction, there are certain phenomena that happen, and that's what defines rolling communication. So we can talk a little bit about the dynamic that happens when you get to metaphysical communication and move in a positive direction instead. So when it comes to rolling communication, the thing that we're considering is that we've gone past the gap. You've gotten kind of into the energy saving mode, and then for whatever reason, we have to continue communicating, or we have to continue expressing ourselves, or we're in some situation where we're not able to use one of the other communication types like metaphysical or impulsive communication to really get our point across. So what ends up happening is that we deal with our energy saving mode, but we try to access something that happened in intelligence. So when we move from the R scale to the Z scale, we sort of close down the capacity to make those connections. And just a little review about the entire process of intelligence. What you're trying to do over here is take an idea, reactivate it, take another idea, activate that, and then draw a new connection between there. And if you remember, the connection that we make between there is a characteristic of communication, and that has about 3 units when compared to the 3 halves of the individual unit. And if we look in this area of the Z scale, we're using those same components of impulse, but we're using them at this ratio. We're using them at 1/2, 3 halves, 1/2. And if we're doing this in intelligence, there's about 3 units of information. We do that again, and there's about 6 units of information, and so on. The ratios that we're using to access these are going to be a little bit different. Not only that, once we apply compression, and we kind of explain how these get compressed, the ratio is going to be a little bit different. If we look at 1/2 to 3 halves to 1/2, you realize you're going to need almost double the amount of compression to save this information. So instead of it being stored at 3 halves, it's going to be stored at about 3, about that ratio. So there's about double amount of information that is involved in the storage of the characteristics versus a storage of a single cycle of communication. So what's happening in rolling communication is we're getting somewhere in between there. We're mixing these two up. So even though our impulse is only about 1/2 unit, we're trying to access 3 units of information with a much smaller impulse. And that leads to a mismatch of what otherwise is considered a really congruent and really neat and tidy system. And that mismatch is what defines rolling communication. And in rolling communication, the process that defines that in terms of its unit, the same way that we have a cycle of communication, the same way we have a characteristic in intelligence, and the same way we have the ranges in post-intelligence. In rolling communication, what we have is something called a pseudo-additive impulse. And essentially what's happening is that the access, the whole process of recalling information is limited. It's limited by this entire limit of the gap. And since we have such a limited amount of resources, if we try to zap that memory with just the small amount of impulse, the memory that we're trying to access is considered to be something that was compressed in intelligence, and it only partially reactivates that sort of thing. So the range for rolling communication is going to take us from our turnaround, from the metaphysical orientation, and we're going to move in a positive direction, and we're going to go to the gap. We're going to go all the way to negative 117. And what happens is that you try to bring up some information, and then you bring up something else, and you say this about it, and then you try to say that because of this, and this because of that, and all of a sudden the ideas that you have are kind of rolling into one another, but you're not necessarily getting the point across. You're kind of just circling around it. And that's sort of the hallmark of what rolling communication is about. And it's also really important to describe complex communication a little bit later. But the tendency is to work your way all the way back to the gap. And you kind of stay there. And you kind of wait until more information is brought about. You kind of wait until somebody else says something. And as long as the information they give you isn't new, or it's something that you had not missed out on, or as long as it's something that you've already considered or you've already mentioned, then there's no problem. But as soon as somebody throws something unexpected in there, all of a sudden, boom, you hit another limit. And it's the same as hitting the gap from the intelligent direction, it's the same as hitting the vertical gap. But whenever you use pseudo-additive impulse to get back to the gap, the process where you kind of sort of break apart all of that information you were trying to associate with one another, the thing that you end up with is a process that's called popping. So once you get to the negative 117, and once you add anything to that, plus whatever, it doesn't really make a difference as long as it's something that's not included in negative 180 to negative 117. Even if it's organized in a different way, even if it's brought up at a different angle, you end up with a process that's called popping. And the reason that's a little bit different than gap is that at the gap, your brain slows you down. Your brain stops you from considering more information. Whenever you go from the other direction, your brain is forcing you to consider more information when there's no more space to do any of that. So you're forcing your brain to stop considering all these different pseudo-additive cycles. And once you do that, you have to think through your entire logic again, and you have to think through all the different stuff that becomes meaningful. But one of the main reasons that people do that is because they don't really understand why all of a sudden they're not able to continue with their train of thought in intelligence. And they're trying to work their way back to wherever that consideration was. They're trying to work their way back to that relationship, and they're trying to figure out why things had changed all of a sudden. And anyway, doing that through rolling communication leads to something called popping. And that happens when you've already considered or filled up your capacity with information, and then all of a sudden you have to consider more information. So you have to kind of redraw that mental map to try to get back to that level of consideration. And it's a very vicious cycle because you're doing that hoping that you've considered everything. But it's a very sort of haphazard and inefficient way to consider all that information. It's made of a bunch of mismatched kind of things and some incongruencies and so forth. And beyond that, it's just very taxing. It's very difficult to do. I would like to go ahead and start transitioning into complex communication, but before I do that, one thing I want to mention is olfaction, which is smell. And there are a couple different reasons that it's important. The thing that I want to bring up isn't going to be olfaction generally, but one thing that people will do is they will try to have this sort of process of adding something. They'll try to make this something familiar, which is going to be the symbol that Standard 3 uses for olfaction is kind of this giant looking kind of squiggle or lightning bolt. It's kind of meant to be an inverted version of this. But the idea with olfaction is that it provides maximum impulse to the brain. It's kind of hardwired directly into the brain and provides a maximum amount of impulse. So one thing that people who rely on rolling communication will do is try to associate anything they can with that logic and that thought process. And that's what allows them to make an association that is familiar to them. If you think back to super social communication, one thing that you would need to have is a rule or some other policy or some other procedure that allows you to consider that without having to solve the relationship between that information that kind of overloads the brain. And with popping, instead of having that policy or procedure, one thing that people can use instead is smell, is olfaction. And they can use that to relate their environmental kind of status and how they're feeling and all the different aspects of logic to that scent. And when they want to try to communicate what they were going through at that time, they can try to think of that scent, and that can, bring them back into that place, and that can allow them to follow through with their logic again and so on. But that is one way that you can add some additional consideration to something that's otherwise very irregular and very difficult to compress or to make meaning of or to keep together. One thing that you can try to do is replace either the impulse or the compression with a sort of smell or with a sense of olfaction. But standard theory defines olfaction on its own. It's its own cranial nerve. It's kind of hardwired into the brain. It's an emergency response. And it's very much related to complex communication, and is very much related to the Z-naught scale. But the reason it's used, the symbol is kind of used, is to differentiate it from the Z-naught scale because it's its own thing. It's kind of difficult to really explain, but if you drew a proportionate sort of cycle of communication to this sort of process of olfaction, you'd have probably about that much impulse versus about that much impulse in olfaction. So it's about 4 times or so the amount of impulse. That's what standard theory asserts. It's just a much more strongly connected impulse. And what can happen is that people will use this much stronger impulse to facilitate one of the components during these kind of extreme times in rolling communication and in the complex communication. And they can use it as an alternate way to associate memories and experiences that otherwise would not be well handled by the capacity of the brain alone. You can also think of it as a survival response. The thing that standard theory says is that it's related to how pleasant a smell is, and those pleasant smells are supposed to facilitate sources of nutrients and survival, while unpleasant smells are supposed to be dangerous and kind of prevent you from going near them. So it's its own kind of primal impulse sort of thing, but that's olfaction's role in dealing with rolling communication, as well as complex communication, which is the third part of the Z scale. So just to recap the first 2 parts of the Z scale, there's the normal range, which is post-intelligent impulse. There's the rolling range, which deals with the pseudo-additive impulse, which is sort of the mix between intelligent experience and impulsive experience. And then finally, we have this slanting line that sort of goes down a little bit further here, and that's the third area of the Z scale, which is part of something called complex communication. So complex communication starts at the sort of maximum of the Z scale, and the range that we define that is from 197 and beyond, negative 197 and beyond. And that forces the brain into a special circumstance. And that circumstance is defined by the additional stimulation that may be happening at that point. Even though the brain is completely taxed out, there's still the potential for something else to be acting upon it, whether it be stimulation from the environment, whether it be internal stimulation, it could be hormones, it could be medication, it could be things like cigarettes, it could be pollution, it could be food additives, it could be any number of things, anything that is different than what the brain normally uses to facilitate itself, any kind of adulterant, any kind of externalized kind of thing. And that range would normally induce a person into rest or something like that. Otherwise, they would not have a reason to continue communicating or continue participating in what's going on. But when that's not an option, when you still are forced to deal with something, or when you have something that's causing that additional stimulation, you still kind of have to do something. Something kind of has to happen. And the process of that is described in complex communication. And there's something that I think is worth mentioning, and it's the limit of how many different things can cause that problem. And if you think of like 197 plus as 197 and then one adulterant, the limit that standard theory talks about would be negative 197 plus, 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 plus. And then you kind of have like the wall, and you sort of go back and forth between there. You have to have some kind of way to cycle through that. But that's pretty much as many different complexities that you can put into how much additional stimulation is going on without falling into like meaninglessness. But that's essentially how far complex communication goes. And each one of these pluses is essentially related to one of the factors of the scale of complex communication. So there are some other terms that the book version uses for complex communication. And if you remember back into the Z-scale, this lowercase Roman numeral 4, the range that's described there is compulsive impulse. So once we get beyond that, there's something that's going to cause that to happen. So the two terms that are also used in the book version to describe complex communication are hormone-induced compulsive impulse and drug-induced compulsive impulse. So when you're dealing with drug-induced compulsive impulse, you can just use these pluses, these plus marks. Someone's kind of taxed out, they're getting stimulated by something and something else, and then they're using whatever that stimulation is to sort of associate with whatever's going on. That's sort of that case scenario. So you can just realize that something and something and something else are related somehow. And it's just drugs that are causing it, or it's a medication that's causing it, or some other substance that you could just kind of consider to be a drug or whatever. But there's also hormone-induced compulsive impulse. And in males, that's very easy. There are only a couple of hormones that are really going to affect that, namely things like testosterone and so on. And you can sort of observe that when they're kind of just running on testosterone only. That's sort of that range of things. But when you think about women, unfortunately, there's a tendency for the amount of hormones they have to process to take them beyond this range, beyond this normal sort of range. And it can happen from anywhere on the scale. They can be right in the middle of somewhere on the R scale. They can have just gotten past the gap into the metaphysical communication, and for whatever reason, their body decides to release all these hormones, and all of a sudden they're forced all the way out of the normal range into complex communication. And that's sort of the female version of hormone-induced compulsive impulse. So that puts them into their own special case, and that special case is organized on something called the Venus scale, which is the V scale. But you can use the V scale to organize complex communication and vice versa. But what ends up happening at this point is essentially an extreme version of pattern recognition. That's kind of what women are left to. So just to sort of recap this last area right here, What we're dealing with is complex communication, and that's kind of our maximum tax on our faculties, kind of maximum tax on our capacity, and then some other adulterant coming in and causing that additional stimulation, whether it be a drug, whether it be a hormone, medication, a food additive, whether it's a social stimulation, whatever. But there's a limit to the number of times that you can meaningfully associate whatever is going on with that person's behavior and so forth. And that limit is about four cycles, 4.5 cycles of communication. And that allows you to consider what may be causing that behavioral anomaly. It's usually just going to be one of those adulterants. But there's a special case where women are forced through all of that just because of their own natural metabolisms, their own functions, and all that. And that is what we can organize using the V scale. So it's part of complex communication, but the V scale is its own special case that is peculiar to women, and we can talk about that next and describe the different levels and what happens with pattern recognition at each level. So at this point, we've introduced the behavioral index. We've talked about the assertions. We've talked about what each of the scales are. We've talked about the Z0 scale. We've talked about the R scale. We've talked about the Z scale. And now we're at an extension of the Z scale, which is known as the V scale, which is short for the Venus scale. And what we're going to do is define the different levels of the Venus scale and talk about what happens in each. So now that we've gone through the entire behavioral index, we've gone to sort of this sloping line and down to the special case, we're going to define everything on the V scale. So the V scale is all about pattern recognition. That's kind of what you're left with when you get out to that level of complexity. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but every complexity is essentially considered to be one of those plus signs after you get to compulsive impulse. It's kind of like 197 plus, 197 plus plus, and so on. Every one of those pluses is a complexity, which is a fancy way of saying that it's there, but we don't know what it is. We may not be able to recognize it exactly, we may be able to guess at what it is, but it's some additional thing that's happening that is pushing us beyond what is normally there. So there are a few different things to consider on the V scale. We have a certain level, which is the sort of organization of each set of patterns. Then we have a factor, which tells us essentially how many options we have there. And then we have a low energy version of that. We have a high energy version of that. And then we can name them the same way that we name the characteristics like silent identity and super social orientation and so on. We can name each level of these. That way we can refer to them instead of calling them by their factor or calling them by the pattern or whatever. We can just name them. So each one of these, same as the characteristics, each level has its own associated factor. Each factor has its associated pattern in low and high energy way. And then we could name that sort of graduation on the scale. So the first level that we have, level 1 essentially, is the 0 factor. So the 0 factor. And that is sort of kind of a way to think of like a redundant sort of thing. It's basically there versus not there. It's kind of active versus not active. And the more you try to look into it, the more it kind of becomes kind of nonsense. You know, if something's there, then it exists. But if it doesn't exist, that means it's not there. But if you're communicating about it, that means it does exist in non-existence and so on. So it's just a sort of starting place. It's just a weird kind of thing, and it's sort of the kind of lowest threshold of getting into complex communication. So the low energy pattern of that is basically 0. That's kind of nothingness, as it were. That's your consideration of nothingness, the kind of concept of that. And then the high energy pattern of that is just 1. That means that there is something there, there's something going on, we can communicate about it. It's kind of sort of redundant, but that's just a 0 factor. So beyond that, we have the second level, which is the first factor. And the first factor deals with 4 complexities. So the little plus signs that you think of after you get to your maximum sort of level, and then there are those things going on. In a low energy format, which is sort of what defines it sort of defines that factor, there are 4 complexities going on. And the thing that you have to do at this point is recognize what's going on with them. And there are a couple different ways to do that. You can recognize this as 1 versus 3. You can recognize this as 3 versus 1. It may happen sometimes. 1 versus 2 versus 1, 2 versus 2. And you kind of do the grouping and sorting thing where you figure out how these are related to one another. And in a high energy sense, one of these is solved for you already. One of those is already done. One of these is active. At least one of them is active. And then from there, you figure out what else is going on. You have 3 other ones happening like that. There can be multiple ones. There can be multiple zeros. But it's a pattern that you have to sort of learn how to recognize. And that is sort of the high energy aspect of it, is that at least one part of it is defined. At least one part of that is known. One part of that has already been answered for you. And what we can refer to this whole thing as is a complex identity. And what we think about that as is defining what the best fit is in terms of the person's own observation. And whatever they observe that pattern to be, whether it be 1 versus 3, whether it be 2 versus 2, or in high energy 1, 0, 1, 0, or 1, 0, 0, 1, or whatever that is going to define what their understanding of that pattern is, and that's going to be defined as their complex identity. So after that, you have a third level, which is the second factor. And how this one deals with 4 complexities, the second factor deals with 7. There are 7 complexities. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the way that this is going to be interpreted is going to be somewhat related to the complex identity. Whatever you see here, now not only do you have your identity, you have to compare it to something else. You have to figure out how that fits in. You have to determine if that pattern is still the same. You have to determine if you have to think of it as a different way, if it's 4 versus 3, if it's all one group of 7, if it's 2 versus 3 versus 2, or whatever may be happening there. You just kind of have to recognize that there are those many things going on, and you have to determine which of those patterns make the most sense. So in the high energy sort of sense, you have something that's already defined, and then you can have some other pattern going along with whatever else is there. So you can have this, and then you have 3 versus 3, 4 versus 2, whatever the pattern happens to be. But you have to compare not only what's going on with the complex identity to these new additional kind of things, you also have to figure out whether or not that is valid, or whether you have to change the idea and so forth. But that whole process is going to be referred to as a complex interaction. So we can go to the 4th level, and this is the 3rd factor. And the 3rd factor has 11 complexities to it. So we have this group of 7. 1. And now we have more stuff to consider. So now there's a group of 4 down here. And it's the same kind of thing. Now you have to figure out how these are related to one another. If it's 7 versus 4, if it's 4 versus 7, but on top of that, you can consider other people's patterns. So somebody else's 7 versus your own 4, your own set of 4 versus somebody else's set of 4, somebody else's set of 4 versus your own set of 4 versus somebody else's set of 7. And you sort of just have to figure out how to group those 11 different complexities. And that's sort of the low energy format. In high energy, there's something that's already been solved. And now you're left with some pattern. There are many different ways in this high energy one to do it, but what we're gonna look at them as is 3 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2. We're just gonna assume that that's what it is. It may not be that way. It may be something different. It depends on what's going on with these interactions and all that other stuff. But what you're trying to determine is which is the larger group and which is the smaller group. And there are a couple different ways to try to do that. But that is referred to as the complex orientation. Okay. And now we have our 5th level, which is the 4th factor. And the 4th factor is the big one. That's kind of what the book refers to it as. But now we have all these 11 things, and we have to add even more to it. So we have some group of 11 here in the low energy. And we have to compare that to some other pattern, which there is a range of these that you can get. So the range that defines this 4th one is going to be between 14 and 17. So you're going to have whatever you have as your orientation and your complex orientation, however many of those are left over, you're going to be comparing that to a new set of things. And it's kind of difficult to explain how that comparison happens, but essentially you're taking your own orientation and you're bringing it into another sort of set of information. And what you have to determine is whether or not, first of all, there's low energy or high energy going on. In low energy, it's usually going to be 14 versus 15 complexities. And then high energy, it's going to be 17 versus 16 complexities. You have to consider all that information, and then you have to compare that to something else that's going on. So that's kind of what gives you all the additional complexities. But after you have all 11 of them, then you have to go. You have to compare those, and essentially you're trying to figure out which one of these best describes where you may be. And it's usually going to be 14 versus 15. Or 17 versus 16. And that sort of defines what your complex orientation is in the 4th factor. It kind of defines what the rule or what the association is with that interaction. And it's very difficult to explain, but if you can imagine going into a room with 17 different bouncy balls, and they're moving all at different speeds, they're going in different directions, they're bouncing off different walls. And once you enter into this factor, you have to take like a mental image of that, and you have to remember everything about how fast they were moving. You have to remember which walls they were bouncing off of. You have to remember everything about them. And then you have to take that and go into a different room where there's basically a similar kind of thing going on. There's all kinds of balls bouncing around. They're moving in different directions. They're going different speeds. They're different colors, all that stuff. And you have to try to figure out total how those two compare to one another. Do you have more balls bouncing around? Do you have fewer bouncing around? Or yours going faster or slower? What are the size differences between them and all that stuff? That's kind of the level of complexity that you're trying to compare at any given time. So the best way to try to mark that is saying, I took this mental image, I'm going to think of this mental image as a square, and I'm going to take it with me Once I get to the other one, I'm going to try to figure out if that other room is more square-like, if it's more hexagonal, if it's more of a triangle, and so on. And that's kind of what you have to do in order to figure out how to solve the problem of comparing those different complexities. And if you're not a woman, it probably makes no sense at all. If you go through that, then it's kind of easy to kind of recognize what that is. But that's essentially what's going on. It's just a very high level of pattern recognition. And when it comes to the other aspect of it, one of these is already solved. You know for sure that you're going to be in the high energy side of things. So whereas the low energy, you could find yourself in 14 versus 15 complexities, or 17 versus 16 complexities. In high energy, you already know that one of those is solved. So we'll try to represent that in a very similar way. There are lots of different ways to sort of define that and to organize them. But in the high energy sense, this is already going to be solved. So you're most likely going to find that you're dealing with either 17 or 16 sort of pattern there. And anyway, that whole process of comparing and sorting those out is referred to as a complex range of communication. And that's kind of a terminal point there. You either end up on 14 or 15, or you end up on 17 or 16, and that sort of becomes your rule or your home base, or how you recognize what goes on beyond your own understanding. So that's pretty much it. The sort of extension to that starts the abnormal version of things, and that's the 6th level. And that's the 5th factor. And what happens at the 5th factor is very similar to what happens at the beginning of all this, where you kind of get to your maximum capacity, and then all of a sudden there's some other additional thing that's causing some continued stimulation. And once you do that, you have an additional kind of so just to recap the normal aspects of the V scale, we have the first level, which is a 0 factor, and that deals with one complexity there. Then the second level is a first factor that deals with 4 different complexities. The third level is a second factor that deals with 7 complexities. The fourth level is a third factor that deals with 11 complexities. And the fifth level is a fourth factor, and that's anywhere from 14 to 17 complexities. And at the first level, we can just refer to that as a 0 factor. The second level is the first factor, and also the complex identity. The third level is the second factor, that's the complex interaction. The fourth level is the third factor, that's a complex orientation. Then the fifth level is the fourth factor, which is the range from 14 to 17, and that's the complex range of communication. So there's one other sort of thing to mention, and that is how this is sort of congruent and similar to the rest of the behavioral index. And what you'll notice here are the sort of ranges of the thinking types. And the way we can look at that is by taking our number of complexities and just solving one of them. So we can subtract one of them, and we'll essentially see the same thing that we see on the R scale. So just kind of to iterate that, if we have one complexity at the first level, and we remove that, then now we're just kind of backing out into the Z0 scale. So there's not really anything to solve there. But if we go to the second level and we back out one, we go from 4 complexities, we solve one of them. Now we have 3 complexities. That is the sort of characteristic that goes along with silent communication. And then if we take the third level, where we have 7 complexities, subtract 1 there, we solve one of those, so we sort of remove that complexity. Now we have 6 things going on, which is the same as intimate communication. That's the sort of limit there. And then the third factor, we have 11 complexities. We remove one of those. Now we have 10 things to consider. That's the beginning of our orthogonal kind of thinking. And if we look at the range, we have 14, 15, 16, and 17. And we're moving in between those. And if you want to remove one or not, we have the same as absolute communication there. We have the 3-party shared intimacy, we have the identity, we have the interaction, the orientation. So that gives us a range, once again, which is kind of like a plus or minus 4. And that is the same, very similar to what you see in supersocial communication. So that gives us a little way, kind of a way to see why those patterns are there and how they're congruent to what you see in the R scale, and how everything in the R scale gets kind of transmuted and squished down, and so on. And the other kind of thing I sort of want to mention is what I'm talking about when it comes to high energy versus low energy. And that's essentially the difference between a characteristic and a cycle of communication in terms of impulse. So anytime you're using impulse, you're trying to save energy, you're trying to conserve energy, and that's going to be described by the Z0 scale and the Z scale. Those are processes where you're trying to conserve as much energy as possible, whereas in high energy, you're trying to expend energy to make new ideas, to solve problems, and so on. So rather than conserving things in low energy, you are expending all of that in high energy. So that is also related to where you get to the V scale from. So if you're going through impulse, when you start the V scale, you're likely going to follow the low energy thing. If you're somewhere in the R scale, whenever you get to the V scale, you're probably going to end up dealing with some of the high energy patterns. But that's sort of the way that you can look at the different levels and the different factors and how that pattern recognition sort of plays out, and why it's sort of self-similar to the rest of the thing, and all that. But to transition from this into the non-standard behavioral index, we'll look at what is non-standard all the way down at the edges of the complex communication type. And that's the 6th level, which is also referred to as the 5th factor. So the 5th factor is basically the same kind of process that gets you into the V scale from the Z scale. So at the end of the Z scale, we have like 197 plus or something like that. The same way we're kind of at our max at the complex range, and then we have something else going on. So we have some other complexity that's happening there. And it's the same with the high energy. There's some amount of complexity that's happening. And that is basically things like drugs and alcohol, other adulterants, cigarettes, food additives, preservatives, just continued stimulation from social communication or the environment or what have you. And what happens is that you, if you're in this sort of state of mind, you'll experience whatever's going on in the complex range based on whatever that additional complexity is. And the best way I can describe that is kind of thinking of like a cartoon scenario where there's like a character who has like something to drink, and all of a sudden the room is kind of fuzzy or looks kind of blurry or something. That's kind of what it's like, is viewing that complex range where all that stuff is going on through that additional complexity. And it kind of depends on what takes you there. It kind of depends on what that complexity is as to how you may experience a complex range. And that's the abnormal version of it. And you can consider that range to be from 17 to 22. 22, but it should be 17 to 21 plus, but that's kind of as far as it goes before you kind of just lose meaning to the fact that there's no real meaningful interpretation going on. It's just all additional sort of external adulteration or external stimulation, or even from an internal sense. But it's something that exists outside of what the brain's normal system should be. So that's kind of the range. You can refer to that whole process as the complexly complex range. And that's sort of the abnormal side of what the V scale is. That's just something that is out of what you consider to be normal. So that's essentially the entirety of the standard behavioral index. So the V scale is what organizes those patterns, and this is a way that we can organize them based on factor, and we can name them, the differences between the high and low energy processes. You can also think of them as kind of directives and deferrals, intelligent versus impulse, and you have a way to organize what would otherwise be sort of overwhelming amount of information, or what you can think of as kind of like an alternate experience. But the V scale allows us to address exactly what's going on, kind of figure out why it's happening, and hopefully be able to solve that problem or address it from there. So at this point, we've gone through the entirety of the standard behavioral index, and what we can do now is just review everything once again. Now that we have everything defined, we have everything labeled, we'll just go through and look at all the standard side of things, just kind of as a wrap up.